My name's Jeff. We're getting to continue our series on grace. We've been trying to look over the last few weeks about what the Bible says about grace, and I really have kind of on purpose not said that you have to show grace. I mean, I've not really done a lot of that. I've just tried to keep the focus on what Jesus did, and it's been interesting talking to people over the last few weeks that people say, I've been really challenged to show a little extra grace here or a little extra grace there. And it really has been cool because we focus on Christ and we focus on what He did and how He acted. I think it does inspire us, hopefully, to want to be a little bit more like that. One verse that we've tried to hit on over and over and over again is this one. It's in John chapter 1. It says, the Word became flesh. He made His dwelling among us. He's talking about Jesus there. And we've seen His glory. The glory of the one and only Son came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And this notion that Jesus was 100% grace and 100% truth, it's an interesting balance. And once you kind of have that in your head, you start seeing that pop up over and over and over again. He shows a lot of grace to a woman who's caught cheating on her family, on her husband, and the penalty in that day was death, and He doesn't give her death. He lets her go, and He challenges her to live different, but he lets her go. We told a story about a wayward son, and who wandered away and hurt his family and hurt his father, and yet when he comes back, just seeking a little mercy, he's overwhelmed by how much grace the Father gives him. He's expecting to get a punishment, and instead he gets a party. We talked about how cruel people, the people who are crucifying Christ, and how they deserve to be lambasted by Him while He's on the cross. And it's not hard to imagine in that day that the people who were crucified did yell awful things out at their people who were crucifying them. The ones who were trapped there in that awful deal would insult and be defiant even until their last breath. And yet Jesus doesn't do that. While He's hanging on the cross, He shows them grace. And it's an interesting picture of Jesus, and it was one that kind of bothered His enemies. It was one of the things they kind of held against Him. I think the fear that if you keep eating with sinners, if you keep showing the worst sorts of people grace, they'll just keep taking advantage of it. And it bothered them. And they would challenge Jesus on it. But it also bothered His friends. When He challenges Peter to keep forgiving, even 70 times 7, they're blown away by that. How's that even possible, Jesus? How could a person show that much grace? And yet He never really wavers from that message. He's 100% truth. I mean, there certainly are consequences to sin, and that's reality. And if you live a certain way, and if you make certain bad choices, you can expect some of those to find you out, because that's how the world works. And Jesus never runs away from that. That's the truth. And He's 100% truth. But in weird moments, He would just show this grace. And this verse, we've not really focused on this aspect of it as we've talked about this verse over the last few weeks, but that is to His glory. That notion that He's full of grace and His truth, that's His glory. And that notion of equating all those things is an Old Testament idea. There's a story in the Old Testament where Moses, where the children of God get crossways with God. They make a golden calf, and for a season there, they kind of wander from God, and it's awful. And it's like probably the lowest moment they have in all of their wandering. And they come back to God, and God is not sure at first He's going to take them back. I mean, there's like this whole argument between He and Moses. I'm not sure I should even take them back. And finally, He decides that He's going to, and I'm going to honor my covenant, even though you didn't honor the covenant. And at the end of the conversation, Moses says to God, well, I think I have it on the screen. Moses says to God, he says, "Show me your glory." And it had mentioned earlier in this passage that Moses would talk to God face to face like one talks to a friend. But here he says, "Show me your glory." Like give me a more intimate, let me really see, God, who you are. And the way God answers it, the very next verse, He says, "I will cause all of my goodness to pass in front of you. I'll proclaim my name in your presence. I, the Lord, in your presence. And I will have mercy on whom I'll have mercy, and I'll have compassion on whom I'll have compassion." This is the glory of God. When Moses says, "Let me see your glory," It's his goodness, but it's the fact that he'll have grace. He'll show mercy on people. He'll show compassion on people. They won't deserve it, but he'll do it anyway. And Jesus is reflecting that in the New Testament. Jesus, who is God in the flesh, that's how he is. And you see it over and over and over again, him showing these little mercies and these little graces to people who don't deserve it. Now, today, partly because it's Mother's Day, I'm sure, I was drawn to a different story, and it's still a grace story, but it's one that maybe you wouldn't immediately think of as grace, certainly not in the same scale and way we've talked about it the last few weeks. But I think it's still a really important story about God's grace, and it's a story where Jesus turns water to wine. And a lot of people misunderstand the story, I think. They misunderstand what it's about. Some people want to make the story a commentary on alcohol, that, Jesus drank, so therefore drinking's good, or that Jesus made wine and therefore, and I don't think that's what it's about. I mean, clearly he drinks there, and clearly it really is alcohol. So you can find in there some freedom maybe that some churches wouldn't allow you to have, and I understand that. But how they looked at wine and how we approach wine, it really, how we approach alcohol, it really is a whole different animal. All they ever had was, it wasn't like he could turn the water into Dr. Pepper, It wasn't like and it's just what they had at every meal. It's usually 3 parts water and 1 part wine, and while drunkenness was a real problem in Jesus' day, like it has been in every era since the beginning, most people didn't get drunk when they drank wine. Most people would not drink wine without having the intention. When a person would say today, I need to have a glass of wine at night just to calm down, that really wouldn't be how they approached wine. I need to get a 6-pack with a friend so we can have a good day. That's really not how they would. That's just not how they approached it. It wasn't like it was good or bad. It's just different. And so I don't think this story is about that. I don't think this story really is about weddings. I've seen that argued. Jesus turns water to wine at a wedding, and so clearly he's pro wedding and pro big church gathering celebration weddings, and certainly that's what he's doing. He's attending that, and that's a thing. But that's not really the main agenda. There's a rumor about this story that started really early in church history. We'll read it here in a second. That when Jesus first finds out that they need more wine, he seems like he doesn't want to do it, and Mary kind of twists his arm, and then he does it. And this is what I thought about Mother's Day. There was a rumor really early in the history of the church that's how you get Jesus to do stuff. You pray to Mary. And even in heaven, Mary can kick Jesus around and make him do whatever she wants him to do. And I think that's more of a commentary about moms, really, than it is about Jesus. And I'm not meaning to get into a whole thing there, but I think that's more of a commentary about something else. And I don't think that's what the story is primarily about. And we'll talk about that maybe a little bit there. But it's a really important story about Jesus and who he is and what he is and how he acts, and it's about grace. And, well, here's the story. It says on the 3rd day, and this is the 3rd day after he was baptized, probably is what it's talking about. But whenever you see 3rd day, you might think he's talking about there's more going on, like resurrection thing. But probably just 3rd day since he was baptized. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So it's a pretty big deal. And weddings in those days were whole community events. If you had a wedding, everybody came, and you were expected to come. I mean, it wasn't like you really had a choice, and the whole town would show up. And there were lots of expectations about how weddings would work. Usually the father of the groom would be the guy who kind of initiated he would find some woman for his son, and they would set up an agreement, and most of the time, certainly by Jesus' day, the woman had the option to decline, but this wasn't done very often. And so the father of the groom would find some woman for his son and say, hey, I think this is the one. The son would then go speak to the woman about it, and if she said yes, and they would set up a bride price. they would set up a price to pay for he would have to pay a certain amount of money for her, and it could be quite a bit of money, or it could be a little bit of money, didn't matter, but he'd pay something for her, and they would arrange all that, and then he would tell her, I'm going to go to my father's house and prepare a place for you, and then I'll come back and take you to be with me where I am. And he would go and build on a little room there on the father's house, and then he would go back to her, and sometimes that would happen at night. There's a parable where they all come at night to the groom, and all of his guys come and get her, and she had to be ready because she didn't know for sure when that would happen. And he would come and get her, and he would take her, and then the whole town would show up for this party. And weddings were a week-long affair. And I once went to a wedding that was an hour and 20 minutes, and I thought I was going to die. But this would be like as a week. But part of that though is because like we go to a wedding today, and most of the wedding is you're sitting there and you're watching the front, and it's kind of past. That's not really how this operated. This was a little more of everybody's yelling and everybody's kind of together, and they would make an agreement together. It's called the ketubah, and they would sign that, and this is our agreement. I'm going to provide for you, and you're going to, we'll be together, and then they would. We don't know when the breaking the glass thing started. It may have started pretty early. They may have even been doing something like that during Jesus' day, where at the very end they would shatter a glass, and it was like symbolic of how the old way is gone, and now we're into something new. And pretty quick they would do a thing called a huppah, where they would put a sheet on 4 stakes, and it'd be above them, and that's probably after Jesus' day. Probably at this point, the huppah is just the new room that he's built. And anyway, the whole the town excited about this thing, and there would be like a lot of wine and a lot of celebration. And then after a certain amount of time during the wedding, the bride and groom would go into the wedding deal and consummate the marriage while everyone waited outside. This would be awful. This would be a terrible, and they're all waiting, and then I guess he would come out like this, and then it's done, and then they'd have a party, and it would last for a week, and that's how Jewish weddings went. And there was a lot of honor and shame tied to the whole thing. It was like you were expected to give gifts to honor the family. There's even evidence that there could be legal ramifications if you didn't bring the right kind of gift, because it would be dishonoring to the family. There were legal. Jesus tells a story about a guy who invites people to his son's wedding, and they made excuses later. Like they agreed to come, but then later made excuses they wouldn't come, and how big a deal that was. It was the kind of, if you skipped out after you said you'd be there, it's huge shame to the family. It's a very much a shame-based culture. And there was just certain things were supposed to work certain ways, and everybody understood that. And that's all going on here. And so they're all invited to the wedding, and the wine was gone. And it's pretty early in the wedding. And Jesus' mother says they have no more wine. And in that kind of a culture, just such a gigantic deal. Just such a gigantic deal. And it could be because they were poor, the couple. Probably that's the most likely reason, that they were a poor couple and they just didn't have enough money set back for it. The people drank more than they thought they would, or maybe they were trying to go cheap. We'll water it down a little more. And instead of 3-to-1, we'll do 4-to-1 or 5-to-1, and they just miscalculated, and it's all gone, and people are still there, and the wine's gone. And this, in that culture, with all the honor and shame stuff, it's going to follow them the rest of their life. That they're cheap, and that they're poor, and that they're no good. Kind of a trash kind of family. And so Jesus' mother says they have no more wine, and it's really kind of unclear what she expects him to do about it. There's a story with Jesus later on where the disciples go to him and say, hey, Jesus, there's no more food. And Jesus says, well, let's take care of it. And the disciples think, well, if we all chipped in, I guess we could buy each person a bite, And maybe that's what she's expecting him to do. Like, you guys need to chip in, get some more wine. And Jesus' first answer is, woman, why are you involving me? My hour's not yet come. And you could read this pretty hard. Certainly in English in America today, that'd be a pretty hard response. But it doesn't seem to make Mary mad when he says it. And the gist of it seems to be, what business is this of mine? Which, to be fair, is the same attitude that everybody else at the wedding would have taken. Everybody else would have taken that same attitude. How's this my problem? You know, there's an American proverb that your lack of planning does not constitute my emergency. And that's sort of what Jesus is saying. You know, it's not my, and again, this is what everybody was probably going to say. You know, it's how people are. When you make a big mistake in front of everybody, everybody's happy to ride hard on that. But Mary doesn't really take no for an answer. And she says, you to the servants, you do whatever he tells you. She just had a feeling that Jesus was going to do something. And so nearby was some stone water jars. One of the things with the wedding was, there's two things with the wedding. The first is that there were really intricate rules about hand washing. If you wanted to be a proper Jewish family and a proper Jewish, so you had to have enough water so everybody could wash their hands. There was also a deal where the bride was supposed to be kind of baptized before she went into, like washed head to toe, like she's completely transformed into this new thing. Paul picks up some of that in Ephesians. He says a good groom will wash his wife like with water from the word. He's kind of pulling on that tradition when he talks about that here. And there could be some of that going on. But you had a lot of water set aside for all these ceremonies. And it wasn't commanded in Scripture. It wasn't like there was a Bible command to do it. It's just all the stuff that had added on to Scripture, all the little traditions that people have, you know. And it wasn't required by God, but it certainly was required by people. And if you want to be a good person, this is what you got to do. And we still do stuff like that. We do. You can put expectations on people. They dress a certain way, or they act a certain way, or they talk a certain way, they vote a certain way. We can put real pressure on people to conform to what we want them to be, whether the Bible does it or not. And that's what's going on. And they had these big jars, and each one of them held 20 to 30 gallons. I mean, they were just great big stone jars. And Jesus tells the servants, he says, well, fill those jars with water. And so probably some of them already had water in it, but they'd been using it. And so they fill all the jars up with water, and he tells them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. And we don't know for sure what this master of the banquet was today. That's not something that you see at a Jewish wedding today, and we don't know when the traditions changed. But apparently it's not like a wedding coordinator, but it's kind of somebody who's making sure everything goes like it's supposed to go at all the time. And the servants take a little water out of one of those jars, and they take it to the master of the banquet, and it had been turned to wine. And he didn't know where it had come from, but the servants knew. And he calls the bridegroom aside, and he says, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then they bring the cheaper stuff after the guests have had too much to drink, but you've saved the best till now. So it wasn't just wine, but it was fantastic wine. It was pure. I mean, it was really, really good stuff. And he's saying, normally people, they want to put the good stuff out first, and then when people aren't quite themselves, they won't notice. But you've done a different thing here, and this is the whole reason why he does the whole thing. This slide here, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And I wanted to focus on that word sign and that word glory. John doesn't call it a miracle. It certainly is a miracle, but he doesn't call it that. It's a sign. It wasn't done so Jesus could show power, right? It was done so Jesus could show who he was. It's not, in fact, he doesn't really even get credit for it. The disciples know, and some of the servants know, but most of the people don't even know where the water came from or the wine came from. It's only after the fact that this gets talked about. In the moment, most people aren't even aware of what's going on. He doesn't do it to show how strong he is, but to show who he is. It's a sign. And he's hoping that they'll look at this and see what he's done here, and they'll make certain assumptions about him and maybe even certain assumptions about God. So let's think about what he's done here. By turning that water to wine, they didn't have enough. It was going to be a huge shame kind of moment for the family, and Jesus fixes it. So on the very surface level, it shows that he has a heart for people in the small stuff. I mean, he cares about life and death things. He cares about your soul. I mean, he cares about heaven and hell. But I've heard people sometimes pray about a job or pray about how their car keeps breaking down or something like that. And after they pray about it, they'll apologize. I know I shouldn't pray about that silly stuff, but God cares about that small stuff. I mean, it matters to him. And his glory, remember from the very beginning, his glory is his goodness. It's his mercy and it's his compassion. And on the very surface, you learn something about God here. You learn something about Jesus, that he cares about you. Not just about getting you to heaven, but about you. And if it stresses you out, then he cares about it. And that's a pretty important lesson. And a lot of people miss that about God. But there's more than that going on. There's a lot of metaphors with the wedding, the whole thing. And there's a lot of metaphors around wine. And Jesus kind of undoes all of those with this sign. I mean, in the same way that a groom chooses a bride, Jesus says, you didn't choose me, but I chose you to come and be my disciples. And he makes an agreement with us. He tells us what he's going to do for us, and he asks us to do for him. And while we have no wine, you know, we've tried to do it our own way, and we've tried to do it the best we can, and we've tried to figure things out in our own power, and it really hasn't produced like we wanted it to. It really hasn't produced like we hoped that it would. And then Jesus comes in and provides new wine. And it's the kind of wine that can't fit into the old wineskins. It's the kind of wine that can't fit into the old way of doing things. It's a new wine. And it's got more oomph to it than the old did. And it's transformative. And as soon as you taste the new, you don't want the old anymore. As soon as you taste the new, you know that you've got something. Isaiah says, why are you working for wine that can't satisfy? And we can come to Christ and get something else. And while a groom would pay a price for a bride, Jesus paid with his very blood for us. I mean, he gave everything away for us. And earlier in communion, when we took communion, we took the bread and the juice, we remember with that wine, we remember Jesus' blood. When we see that red liquid there in the container, we remember Jesus' blood, which paid for us. When you took that earlier, you're tying yourself to a ceremony and to an event that's as old as Jesus, and it reminds us that he changed everything. It's a sign of a new way and how he saved the best till now. The primary point is that Jesus is a new and a living way. And it's for disciples, and it's for servants, and it's for people who have had too much to drink at the last wedding they went to. It's for everybody. And he comes and offers it to you if you want it. We're told that at the very end of time, the great reunion at the end will be like a wedding. Revelation says it's the wedding feast or the wedding supper of the Lamb, and we'll all get together and celebrate. And it uses language like bride and bridegroom, how we will be dressed like a bride for him and washed clean, you know, and transformed, and that he's already went away to prepare a place for us, and now he's going to come and take us to be where he's at. It's called a wedding feast where everybody gets together and celebrates, and you've been invited into it. And it's the pitch that I'm making here, the sales pitch I'm making here is the same sales pitch that we've made since the very beginning. Why buy milk and wine and bread that doesn't satisfy? Come and eat at the Father's banquet, where all the wine is the very best quality and comes without cost. You've been invited to come back to him. Now, of course, and this can't be ignored. Not everybody feels like that about the wine they've been drinking, the life they've been living. Some people are pretty satisfied with how their life is going. And I understand that. And I'm not trying to twist you here and make you feel something you don't feel. But for anybody out here who can sense and feel and they know that their way of doing it really hasn't worked, then I want to invite you to come back to God. The God who made you, the God who designed you, the God who laid out every day for you is still there to grab a hold of you now. And he still invites you to come back. And any one of you at any moment can grab a hold of him and he'll change everything. Let me pray with you. Dear Lord God,